My prosthetic hand started smoking in the middle of a state exam. I begged my teacher for help, but he just stared at me, repeating the words state testing protocol. While my classmate screamed, he walked over, grabbed my arm, and yanked. He didn't just pull off a piece of equipment. He ripped the metal post straight out of my bone. He chose a test score over my life, and I was going to make sure he paid for it, limb by limb. The silence of the testing room was a physical entity, a thick, oppressive blanket woven from the frantic scratching of pencils and the collective anxiety of 30 teenagers. I was halfway through the state English exam, my focus a tight, narrow beam on the bubble sheet in front of me, when the first tremor ran through my right arm. It was a subtle vibration, a low hum from the motors inside my prosthetic hand that I initially dismissed as a normal recalibration. But then the humming escalated into a strained, high-pitched whine, like a machine being pushed past its limits. My fingers, which had been resting loosely on the edge of the desk, began to twitch, then curl inward, pulling into a tight, unnatural fist. The movement was jerky, convulsive. It wasn't my command. "Mr. Rogers," I gasped, the sound swallowed by the cavernous quiet of the room. The motors whined louder, a desperate, mechanical scream. Something's wrong with my prosthetic. Mr. Rogers, a man whose entire personality seemed to be constructed from rigid adherence to rules, didn't even bother to glance up from the clipboard he held like a shield. His voice was flat, devoid of any curiosity or concern. State testing protocol. No disruptions. No exceptions. The words were a brick wall. The mechanical fingers were now digging into the soft plastic of my prosthetic palm, the pressure intensifying with each passing second. This was beyond a malfunction. It was a catastrophic failure. The internal sensors, the safety features designed to prevent exactly this from happening, were offline. "This is a medical emergency," I pleaded, my voice rising in panic. "The safety features aren't working." This time, he looked at me. His eyes, cold and dismissive, scanned me with open suspicion. "How convenient," he sneered, a small, cruel smile touching his lips. "Your prosthetic just happens to break during the most important test of the year." A sharp crack echoed in the silent room. One of the high-tensile plastic joints in the thumb had snapped under the relentless pressure. "It's literally breaking apart," I said, my voice shaking as much as my hand. He shrugged, a gesture of profound indifference. "Then you should have taken better care of your equipment." The prosthetic hand was engineered to mimic the grip strength of a normal human hand, around 75 pounds of pressure per square inch. But this was different. This felt like a hydraulic press. The squeezing was now a crushing force, radiating pain up my forearm where the titanium post was anchored directly into my bone. "Please," I begged, "just let me disconnect it. There's an emergency release button." He took a step toward my desk, his posture menacing. "Touch that device and you fail automatically. No electronic devices are allowed during state exams. That is the rule." Destiny, the girl sitting in the desk next to mine, leaned over, her eyes wide with fear. She whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. Is that smoke coming from your arm?" I looked down. A thin, gray fog was coiling up from my wrist joint, a sinister vapor rising from the place where the overworked motors were beginning to overheat. The acrid smell of burning plastic and melting wires filled my nostrils, a toxic perfume of disaster. A searing heat began to spread up my forearm, a phantom fire crawling along nerves that were screaming in protest. "Mr. Rogers, it's literally on fire," I yelled, the last vestiges of composure gone. He glanced at the clock on the wall, completely ignoring the smoke. "Stop being dramatic. We only have 17 minutes left." Suddenly, the prosthetic hand jerked open with a violent spasm, all 5 fingers shooting straight out with the force of a spring trap. A split second later, it slammed back into a fist with such brutal velocity that it cracked the solid wood of my desk. The impact sent a shockwave of agony through my entire arm. It felt like someone had clamped a vise onto my bone and was trying to unscrew my limb from my body. From the back row, a voice cried out. Oh my gosh! It was Willie, a quiet kid who never spoke up. He was on his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "We need to get him help now, before something worse happens." Mr. Rogers' face contorted with rage, his skin turning a blotchy, furious red. "Silence," he roared, the word echoing off the cinderblock walls. "The next person who speaks gets expelled from the district." 2 rows over, Jane was frantically texting under her desk, her thumbs a blur as she tried to stay hidden. "I'm calling my mom," she whispered to the person next to her. She's a nurse at the hospital. Mr. Rogers was already marching toward her, his hand extended like a hawk's talon. Phone. Now. My own left hand was shaking too violently to be of any use. I tried to reach for the small, recessed emergency release button on the prosthetic's forearm, but my fingers were clumsy and uncooperative, unable to find their purchase. The prosthetic was rotating now, the entire hand spinning on the wrist joint, twisting far beyond its normal range of motion. With every grotesque rotation, I felt a tearing sensation deep within my arm. A warm, wet feeling trickled down my skin. I looked down to see a dark rivulet of blood running down my forearm, dripping from my elbow onto the pristine white surface of my test paper, a crimson stain on the bubble sheet. Someone call 911. The shout came from Destiny. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she jumped from her seat and made a desperate run for the classroom door. But Mr. Rogers, surprisingly quick for his age, moved to block her path, physically barring her exit. Sit down immediately, or you're suspended for the rest of the year, he commanded. He's bleeding and he needs medical attention, she screamed, her voice raw with a mixture of terror and fury, right in his face. He was unmoved. Everyone needs to put their phones away now. State testing violations will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The dam of student fear finally broke. 3 more students stood up at once. Josh, the school's star quarterback, a golden boy who had never seen the inside of a principal's office, stepped into the aisle, his face a mask of grim determination. This is insane, Josh said, his voice steady and firm. You need to let him get help before it's too late. Mr. Rogers turned his venomous glare on him. You want to lose your football scholarship, Josh? You want to explain to college scouts why you have an expulsion on your record? Then sit down and be quiet. Every forced rotation of the mechanical hand sent a fresh bolt of lightning through my nerves. The burning smell grew stronger, thicker, choking me. Just rip it off. Get it over with, someone yelled from a corner of the room. But I couldn't. It wasn't like taking off a glove. The titanium post, the very core of the prosthetic, was surgically osseointegrated into my ulna. After 8 months of painful procedures, it had been drilled directly into the marrow of my bone, becoming a part of my skeleton. Ripping it off was an unimaginable horror. Near the windows, Katie was sobbing, banging her fist against a glass pane that looked out into the empty hallway. Help! Somebody! Please help us! He's dying in here. The sound was muffled, useless. Mr. Rogers ignored her. He ignored all of them. He marched over to where I was writhing in my seat, my body contorted in agony. This ridiculous performance ends right now, he declared. He was reaching for me. Don't touch it. I screamed, the words tearing from my throat. Mr. Rogers, no. A chorus of student voices yelled in unison as they saw his intention. But he didn't listen. He grabbed the smoking, twisting prosthetic wrist with both of his hands, his grip firm and unforgiving. I have had enough of your attention-seeking behavior and your fake emergencies, he snarled. And then he yanked with all of his considerable strength. The sound that ripped out of my throat wasn't human. It was a sound of pure, primal agony, a shriek from the deepest pit of unimaginable pain. He didn't just pull off a prosthetic. In that one horrific moment of violence, he ripped the metal post, my bone, my flesh, and my nerves apart. The wet, tearing sound of it was the most sickening thing I have ever heard. Blood didn't just drip, it sprayed, arcing across 3 desks in a grotesque, crimson shower. The world tilted, and I hit the floor hard, the linoleum cold against my cheek. I instinctively clutched what was left of my arm with my remaining hand, a mangled stump of tissue and shattered bone. The classroom erupted into a cacophony of screams. Oh my gosh! Oh my gosh! Multiple voices were screaming at once, a symphony of terror. Mr. Rogers was backing away slowly, his eyes wide with disbelief. He was still holding my prosthetic hand, my flesh and tissue still hanging from it like some macabre trophy. His face, once red with anger, was now a ghostly, chalky white. State testing protocol says, he stammered, the words nonsensical in the face of the carnage he had wrought. Willie was slamming his full body weight against the locked door again and again. It's locked. Why the hell is it locked? Automatic locks, someone choked out. They engage during testing periods. No one leaves for another 13 minutes. 13 minutes. An eternity. Josh and 3 other football players, their faces pale with shock but their eyes blazing with fury, rushed toward Mr. Rogers. Give us your keys. Right now. Stay back, he shrieked, holding on my severed arm as if it were a weapon. You're all getting expelled. You're all losing your futures. My vision was tunneling, the edges turning black. The pain was reaching a level beyond description, a white-hot nova exploding in my shoulder and radiating through every cell in my body. A face swam into view above me. It was Destiny. "Stay with me," she pleaded, slapping my face gently. "Keep your eyes open. Don't you dare close your eyes." More students were pounding on the door, a frantic, desperate drumming from both inside and out. Someone, in a moment of clarity, picked up a desk chair. "Don't you dare break that property." Mr. Rogers began to screech. A deafening crash drowned him out. The window and the door shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces as the chair went sailing through it. And then, with a thunderous bang, the door itself exploded open. The janitor stood in the doorway, a set of master keys clutched in his hand. His eyes widened in horror as he took in the scene of blood, chaos, and a teacher holding a severed limb. "What the F? Call 911 now." Everyone screamed at once. The first thing that clawed its way through the morphine-induced fog was the sound. That wet, tearing noise. The sound of the titanium post being ripped out of my bone. My eyes shot open, slamming into the harsh reality of bright fluorescent lights and the relentless, rhythmic beeping of monitors. The room was sterile, white, and smelled of antiseptic. An ICU. A nurse, who had been checking the 4-line in my remaining hand, jumped back in surprise as I began to thrash, a wild animal caught in a trap. She grabbed my shoulders, her voice a calming mantra in the storm of my panic. "You're safe now. You're in the ICU. It's okay, you're safe." I tried to speak, to ask what happened, where I was, but my throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. All that came out was a dry, pathetic croak. She offered me iced chips, their coldness a small, blessed relief on my parched tongue. As they melted, she gently explained that I'd been unconscious for 2 days, that I had undergone 3 back-to-back surgeries. "You've been screaming in your sleep," she said quietly, her eyes full of a pity I wasn't ready to process, as she adjusted the morphine drip. My parents were slumped in chairs by the window, looking like they had aged a decade. My mother's eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, a roadmap of tears. My father's hands trembled as he pushed himself to his feet and walked to my bedside. They had been here the whole time. They had heard everything, every nightmare-fueled scream, every tortured echo of that classroom. A detective arrived that afternoon, his presence a stark intrusion into the fragile bubble of my recovery. I was still floating in a hazy, opiate-induced dreamscape. He pulled out a notebook, the click of his pen unnaturally loud as he asked me to start from the beginning. My words came out slow and slurred, disjointed fragments of a nightmare. I told him about the prosthetic crushing itself, the acrid smoke, the searing heat, and Mr. Rogers' cold, unyielding refrain of protocol. I recounted every horrifying detail, including the locked doors that had sealed my fate for 13 agonizing minutes while I bled out on the cold linoleum floor. "We have the prosthetic as evidence," he said, his voice carefully neutral as he flipped through photos on his phone. He showed me one. The image made my stomach clench. My own tissue, my flesh, was still hanging from the metal fingers, a grotesque prop from a horror movie. It was my arm, but it wasn't. The school district's representative arrived the next morning. She was a woman in a crisp suit who stood at the foot of my bed and read from a set of neatly printed index cards, her voice a robotic drone. She spoke of their ongoing investigation and their unwavering commitment to student safety. Her eyes darted around the room, to the ceiling, the walls, the blinking monitors, anywhere but the thick, white bandages that swaddled what was left of my arm. She droned on about policies and procedures, a litany of bureaucratic nonsense, while I watched the clear fluid in the 4-bag drip, 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 and counted the seconds until she would vanish. "Get out," I finally managed to rasp. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of my agony. She practically fled the room. Destiny showed up on day 3. She looked as haunted as I felt, as if she hadn't slept a single minute since the incident. Her hands shook, and the moment she sat down, tears began to roll down her face. "I should have tackled him," she sobbed, the words catching in her throat. "I should have done something sooner. I just stood there." She described the terror of watching me pass out from blood loss, of being utterly convinced that she was watching me die right there on the classroom floor. I tried to reassure her, telling her that she had saved my life by slapping me awake when the world was fading to black, but she just shook her head and cried harder, her guilt a heavy shroud. My phone, which my parents had brought, started buzzing incessantly. A 30-second, grainy video from the classroom had been posted online. You couldn't see much, but you could hear everything. The terrified screams, the desperate pounding on the door, the final, inhuman shriek that I now recognized as my own. The comments section was a wildfire of outrage. People were calling for Mr. Rogers to be fired, arrested, imprisoned. The notifications were a relentless barrage, each ping a tiny hammer blow against my skull. Later that day, the hospital's financial counselor knocked on my door. She carried a thick folder of paperwork and wore a practiced, sympathetic smile. In a calm, detached voice, she explained that a new, state-of-the-art prosthetic would cost a minimum of $40,000, and that figure didn't include the months, possibly years, of grueling physical therapy I would need. Our insurance company was reviewing the incident, trying to determine if the malfunction of the original prosthetic constituted a pre-existing condition that would absolve them of financial responsibility. I wanted to scream, to throw something at her perfectly coiffed hair, but I only had one hand, and it was tethered to an 4-pole. She left a mountain of papers on my bedside table, brochures about payment plans and financial assistance programs that felt like insults. My first physical therapy session was a humiliating lesson in my new reality. The simple act of sitting up without assistance was a monumental challenge. The weight imbalance from my missing arm threw off my entire center of gravity. I kept tipping to one side like a faulty toy. How could a teacher, any human being, watch a child's prosthetic arm smoke and break apart and do nothing? What kind of training, what kind of protocol could possibly justify such monstrous indifference? The therapist was gentle, but every movement, no matter how small, sent lances of fire shooting through my shoulder where surgeons had tried to piece me back together. She helped me stand for 10 agonizing seconds before my legs buckled and I collapsed back on the bed, gasping for air. "We'll take it slow," she promised, making notes on her clipboard. "Maybe 6 months before we can even think about fitting you for a new prosthetic." 6 months. An eternity. That night, the dream came for me again, more vivid than ever. I was back in that testing room, the doors slamming shut over and over, the locks clicking with the finality of a coffin lid. And Mr. Rogers was always there, always reaching for my arm, his face a mask of cold fury, no matter how much I screamed. I woke up to the frantic beeping of monitors, the alarms blaring in protest of my racing heart. A phantom pain, so real it was breathtaking, was burning through an arm that wasn't there anymore. A nurse rushed in, her movements efficient and practiced, and pushed something cool into my foreline. The world softened around the edges, the sharp corners of my terror blurring into a manageable haze. "It's for the anxiety," she explained softly, resetting the alarms. When I finally found the strength to check my phone again, the messages from my classmates were a nauseating split. Half were offering prayers and expressing their shock and horror. The other half were from a darker corner of the internet, posts from anonymous accounts suggesting I had broken my own prosthetic on purpose to get out of the test. One person had written a whole paragraph detailing how convenient it was that my highly advanced device had failed during the most important exam of the year. My finger hovered over the reply button, 1,000 angry responses swirling in my mind. Instead, I methodically deleted every social media app from my phone, severing my connection to a world that felt both suffocatingly close and impossibly distant. My dad came by that evening, his face etched with a grim, weary anger. He sat on the edge of my bed, his voice low and strained. "They arrested Rogers," he said, "in the school parking lot. He still had your prosthetic in his hands, with your tissue still attached to it." His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He took a deep breath before delivering the final blow. "The state testing board has placed him on paid administrative leave, pending their investigation." "Paid leave," he repeated, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "For ripping your arm off, he gets a paid vacation." 10 minutes later, my mom burst through the door, a whirlwind of furious energy. Her phone was already out, her thumb scrolling through the websites of personal injury lawyers. She insisted we needed legal help, right now, this very second. But I told them to wait. A lawyer would mean procedures, settlements, paperwork. It would slow things down. I had other plans, a more direct path to justice. My mother grabbed my good hand, her eyes pleading. "You're in shock," she said. "You're not thinking clearly." But she was wrong. I had never felt more focused, more lucid in my entire life. Mr. Rogers needed to pay for what he did, and the slow, grinding gears of the legal system felt like an unacceptable delay. Just then my phone buzzed. It was a text from Willie. He had sent a photo of the testing room. My desk was still there, the deep crack from the impact of my prosthetic and a jagged scar on its surface. And on the floor, dark, indelible stains they hadn't been able to scrub clean. My blood. I saved the photo to a new folder on my phone. I named it Evidence. Then, I began to type out a list of every single person who was in that room, every witness who saw Mr. Rogers grab my arm and pull until it tore free. The hospital social worker, a kind woman with tired eyes, came in with a thick stack of papers. She explained my rights as a victim, pointing out how the automatically locking doors were a clear and egregious violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, as they had prevented me from receiving medical aid during an emergency. She handed me pamphlets for trauma support groups and disability accommodation services. I nodded and pretended to listen, but my mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about how a quick search on the county property records website had already given me Mr. Rogers' home address. The next morning, from my hospital bed, I called the ADA complaint hotline. I told the woman on the other end of the line everything, my voice shaking with a mixture of pain and rage. I described the automatic locks that had turned my classroom into a prison, the 13 minutes I had been trapped while I was bleeding out on the floor. She kept gasping, her repeated, "Oh my goodness," a small validation of my horror. She promised an immediate and thorough investigation, saying it was the worst violation she had heard of in her 20 years on the job. That afternoon, a text from Josh confirmed my darkest suspicions about the school's priorities. He said the administrators were doubling down, telling everyone that the doors have to lock during state testing, with no exceptions for any reason. Not for fires, not for active shooters, not for a student's arm being ripped from their body. State requirements, they claimed. He had been asking pointed questions in his classes, and the assistant principal had already pulled him aside twice, warning him about his attitude problem and how it might negatively affect his college recommendations. "Keep asking," I texted back. "Record everything they say if you can do it without getting caught." My parents, it turned out, had ignored my request to wait. They went behind my back and hired a high-powered civil attorney named Amina Farouk. She arrived at the hospital wearing a suit that probably cost more than our car, her presence radiating an intense, no-nonsense energy. She immediately began firing off questions, her fingers flying across the screen of her tablet as she took notes. That same day, she filed a flurry of Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) requests demanding all testing protocols, every internal email related to the incident, Mr. Rogers' complete personnel file, and any previous complaints filed against him or the school's testing procedures. I realized then that perhaps having a lawyer wouldn't slow down my other plans. In fact, it might accelerate them, especially when she mentioned she could subpoena security footage and compel people to testify under oath. Amina returned the next day, a formidable stack of document requests in her hand. 17 different demands for every email, policy manual, and complaint from the last 10 years. The district had 30 days to comply. If they try to hide anything, she said, her eyes glinting with a predatory light, I'll file for sanctions and make them pay for the obstruction. An anonymous message arrived on a throwaway Instagram account I created. It was a video. My stomach dropped as I opened it. This one was longer than the first, the audio crystal clear. You could hear Mr. Rogers' chillingly calm voice saying state testing protocol right before the sound of the snap, followed by my unearthly scream. And then his voice again, "Nobody move," as he stood there holding my severed arm, his tone one of dazed authority. Amina watched it 3 times without blinking. "This is it," she said. "This is direct evidence of willful disregard for human safety." He consciously chose testing rules over a student's life. Any jury in the country would be horrified. Diego Alvarez, the head of engineering from the prosthetics company, called my hospital room. He sounded genuinely distraught, explaining he'd heard about the malfunction and wanted to personally examine the failed device to understand what went wrong. He offered a glimmer of hope, mentioning their company insurance might cover a full replacement if their investigation concluded it was a mechanical failure rather than user error. That hope was extinguished 3 days later by a cold, formal letter from my own insurance company. They were launching an investigation to determine if this was a pre-existing device failure that I had neglected to report. All coverage decisions would be paused for up to 6 months pending the outcome of their inquiry. I read the letter twice, then crumpled it into a tight ball and punched the wall with my remaining hand. The impact so hard a nurse came running in, thinking I'd fallen out of bed. The news cycle was a relentless beast. A local reporter, Son Adebayo, somehow got my hospital room number. My mom tried to refuse, but I grabbed the phone. "Come right away," I told him. When he arrived with his cameraman, I didn't hold back. Propped up against the pillows, I recounted every terrifying detail. The whining motors, the gray smoke, the smell of melting plastic, the crushing force of the fingers, the feeling of my arm being unscrewed from my body, and Mr. Rogers' incessant, insane chanting of state testing protocol. The cameraman had to lower his camera twice, his face pale, as Son himself looked like he was going to be sick. The segment aired on the 6 o'clock news. My phone exploded. The next morning, the superintendent's secretary called. Dr. Yara Haddad needed to meet with my parents and me. Immediately. 3 hours later, she swept into my hospital room, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits who positioned themselves by the door like bodyguards. She avoided looking at my bandaged arm, her gaze flitting around the room as her hands trembled slightly. She spoke of finding a path forward, of the district's desire to support my recovery. One of the lawyers stepped forward, pulling a folder from his briefcase, as the superintendent prattled on about healing and moving past this unfortunate situation. He slid a single sheet of paper across my bed tray. At the top, in bold letters, were the words, "Non-disclosure agreement." Below that, a paragraph detailed a $50,000 education grant, payable immediately upon my agreement to cease all public statements and withdraw my ADA complaint. At that exact moment, Amina walked in. She saw the paper, and a sharp, incredulous laugh escaped her lips. She snatched the NDA, her eyes scanning it in seconds, before she tossed it back at the lawyer, as if it were contaminated. I pushed myself up higher in the bed, fueled by a surge of adrenaline. "I don't want your money," I said, my voice shaking but clear. "I want written policy changes, guaranteeing that a medical emergency overrides any testing protocol. I want mandatory training for every proctor in this district on how to respond to a medical crisis. And I want Mr. Rogers permanently banned from ever working with children again, anywhere in this state." The superintendent's face went white. She stammered that they would consider my requests. Amina crossed her arms. "Consider this," she said coldly. "We'll see you in court." After they scurried out, my phone buzzed. It was Destiny. She was in the principal's office, being written up for leaving her seat during the state test. For trying to help me. The school was trying to punish the hero to protect the villain. The way they tried to buy my silence for $50,000 made me wonder how many other unfortunate situations they had buried with a checkbook. It was never about safety, it was about liability. And they were threatening the college applications of the very students who had shown more courage and humanity than any adult in that room. The next day, Josh confirmed the school's campaign of intimidation. His football coach had cornered him after practice, expressing the administration's concern over his outspokenness. The message was clear. If he kept talking, his scholarship recommendations would be in jeopardy. The threats were escalating, but so was our evidence. Amina called that afternoon, her voice electric with excitement. The FOIA documents had arrived, and she had found the smoking gun. The district's official autolock policy explicitly stated there were no overrides for any reason, including medical emergencies. Not only that, she had uncovered 3 previous formal complaints against Mr. Rogers for ignoring student medical needs during tests. An asthma attack where a student was denied his inhaler. A diabetic student who wasn't allowed to check her blood sugar. A student with a seizure disorder whose nurse was barred from the room. We sent everything to Son. He ran another segment that night, displaying the damning documents on screen for the entire city to see. The reaction was explosive. Parents were incandescent with rage. A petition demanding the district change the lock policy garnered over 800 signatures in 2 days. The school board was forced to schedule an emergency meeting as their phone lines were flooded with furious calls. A message came through from an unrecognized number. It was the janitor. He told me something the district had conveniently omitted. The master key system had a built-in 5-minute delay during testing periods. A security feature. I had bled on the floor for 5 extra minutes by design. My parents then confessed they had hired a private investigator, a man named Merrick Kowalski. He had already discovered that Mr. Rogers had been involved in 2 previous incidents at other schools, both involving physically restraining students during standardized tests. Both cases had been settled quietly, the families silenced by NDAs, allowing Mr. Rogers to simply move to a new district and a new set of unsuspecting victims. The district hadn't just been negligent. They had knowingly hired a predator. The trauma began to manifest in insidious ways. 2 weeks later, I was in the grocery store when a toy robot on a shelf started making a high-pitched, mechanical whining sound. My body seized. The milk carton slipped from my grasp, exploding on the tiled floor. The sound in my head grew louder, drowning out everything else, and suddenly I was back in that room. The smell of burning plastic in my nostrils, the feeling of my arm twisting. I collapsed, my knees hitting the wet floor, and curled into a ball, shaking uncontrollably. An old woman found me, a crumpled heap by the dairy case, and called 911. At the ER, they pumped me full of anti-anxiety medication. That night, sleep was impossible. At 2 a.m., I found myself parked across the street from Mr. Rogers' house. I just sat there in the dark for over an hour, staring at his front door, my mind a maelstrom of violent, vengeful fantasies. The intensity of my own rage scared me, and I finally drove home, my knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel. My parents insisted I start seeing a trauma therapist, Dr. Priya Nair. She taught me grounding exercises, breathing techniques. She told me the revenge fantasies were normal, but warned me not to act on them. I nodded and agreed, all the while mentally reviewing Merrick's notes on Mr. Rogers' daily routine. The civil deposition was 5 hours of pure hell. Mr. Rogers' lawyer was a shark, relentlessly suggesting I was a dramatic teenager who had exaggerated my injuries for attention, even implying I'd damaged my own prosthetic to get out of the test. Amina had to physically restrain herself from lunging across the table. By the end, I was drenched in sweat, the phantom limb pain so intense I could barely walk. At the State Education Board hearing, the district's lawyers tried to shift all the blame. They blamed Diego's prosthetics company, claiming the device was defective. They brought in a paid expert who testified that I must have damaged it myself. The teachers' union released a statement supporting established testing protocols, a cowardly, veiled defense of Mr. Rogers. It felt like the entire system was closing ranks to protect itself. Then came a devastating blow. Diego called with his lab report. There was water damage inside the prosthetic. I remembered spilling a sports drink on it weeks before the test. The moisture had slowly corroded the motor controls, causing the circuits to short out and overheat. It was a perfect storm of mechanical failure, but the water damage gave Mr. Rogers' lawyer the ammunition he needed. In our next session, Priya gently pushed me to channel my anger into advocacy for policy change rather than personal revenge. It will help more kids in the future, she said. I agreed out loud, feigning a therapeutic breakthrough while my mind was plotting. The students, however, were not so easily silenced. Josh, defying the threats to his scholarship, organized a massive walkout. 300 students surrounded the district office, holding signs with my picture, chanting for change. The local news was there, filming everything. Panicked, the district announced they would hire an independent consultant to review their policies, a transparent stalling tactic that fooled no one. The prosecutor's office called me in. Mr. Rogers' lawyer was offering a deal. He would plead guilty to reckless endangerment in exchange for 2 years of probation. No jail time. The man who had ripped my arm from my body would walk free. The revelation about the water damage felt too convenient, a perfectly timed excuse that absolved the school of its most egregious failures. It didn't change the fact that they had locked me in a room to bleed. It didn't change the fact that Mr. Rogers had a history of violence. It didn't change what he did. I spent the next 3 days pouring every ounce of my pain and rage into my victim impact statement. I described the wet, ripping sound, the spray of blood, the sight of him holding my limb. Destiny's parents hired a lawyer, and the disciplinary threat against her vanished overnight. At the next school board meeting, Josh's coach publicly defended him, stating that integrity mattered more than following bad rules. The room erupted in applause. Small victories, but they were chipping away at the district stone wall. My surgical team laid out the options. Reattaching a new prosthetic would be a year-long ordeal of healing and reconstruction. At the criminal hearing, I saw Mr. Rogers in the hallway. He looked smaller, grayer, a pathetic shell of the monster from my nightmares. He started to stand, to speak to me, but his lawyer yanked him back down onto the bench. The irony was not lost on me. In a moment of triumph, the prosecutor, armed with our evidence, successfully added a charge of willful disregard for safety. The district, finally feeling the pressure, came back to the negotiating table for the civil case. They offered what I had asked for from the beginning, not just money but policy changes. Mandatory medical emergency overrides. Annual safety training. A victim's fund for other students. My parents wanted me to hold out for more money, but I knew this was the real victory. These changes would save someone else from my fate. I signed a settlement. At the next school board meeting, faced with a room full of furious parents, the board voted unanimously to end the autolock policy. 3 days later, I sat in the courtroom and watched Mr. Rogers plead guilty to all charges. The judge sentenced him to 2 years of probation, but, most importantly, his teaching license was permanently revoked. He would never be in a classroom again. The civil settlement was finalized, $200,000 for my medical costs, and an NDA that, thanks to Amina's fierce negotiation, still allowed me to speak out about the safety issues. Destiny's record was cleared. Josh received a leadership award. The other students who had helped received official letters of commendation. The system had bent, however slightly, toward justice. The road to recovery was long. My new prosthetic fitting was an emotional, painstaking process. My nightmares lessened. I attended a school safety forum, my voice shaking only once as I told my story. A parent coalition formed, turning our tragedy into a movement. Diego's company issued a recall for the motor assembly in my old prosthetic model, acknowledging a design flaw, and covered the cost of my new, more advanced arm. 6 months after the incident, Priya took me back to the testing room. They had replaced the desks, scrubbed the floors. It was just a room. I didn't panic. I just felt a hollow emptiness, a sign, she said, that I was processing the trauma, not being controlled by it. The district installed big, red emergency override buttons next to every classroom door. The court issued a permanent no-contact order against Mr. Rogers. A follow-up news segment highlighted the new safety protocols saving other students during medical emergencies. I learned to drive with one-handed controls. I practiced picking up a pencil with my new myoelectric hand 47 times until I got it right. Destiny organized a dinner with our friends. We talked about movies and summer jobs and college applications. We were just kids again, not just the survivors of that day. On Priya's suggestion, I wrote a long, venomous letter to Mr. Rogers, pouring out all my remaining rage, and then we burned it in her office fireplace, laughing through tears as we set off the smoke alarm. 6 months after that day, I woke up one morning and realized I had slept through the entire night. My first thought wasn't of Mr. Rogers or the testing room or the sound of my own screaming. It was of the waffles my mom was making downstairs. I wasn't the kid who got his arm ripped off anymore. I was just me.